before sunrise on a mild summer morning in June 1995. A 27-year-old television news anchor named Jodi Huisentruit hurriedly left her apartment in Mason City, Iowa, headed for work. But she never arrived, and her disappearance has never been solved. In 2003, two television news reporters created FindJodi.com, a website dedicated to preserving Jodi's memory and keeping her case alive. This is the official Find Jodi podcast. Welcome back to the Find Jodi podcast. I'm Scott Fuller. Thank you for listening. And on this episode, we are joined by Find Jodi team member Caroline Lowe once again. Caroline and I had a chance to get together in Mason City recently within the last couple of weeks. And she and I took the time and the opportunity to visit the scene, that being the Key Apartments where Jodi Huisentruit was abducted in June of 1995. Obviously, for more on the case, see previous episodes. But Caroline joining us now after her visit to Iowa. And Caroline, you and I got to walk the scene. You've been there obviously before, but it's been a few years. First of all, before we get to the Key Apartments itself and sort of a renewed perspective or refresher that you might have on the Key Apartments, what was it like to be back in Mason City?
I found it very emotional to be back in Mason City. As you said, I've been there many times over the years, both initially covering the case in more recent years for the dedication of our Find Jodi billboard on Jodi's 50th birthday in 2018. The Walk for Jodi we did on the 20th anniversary. But being there, I always look for clues. I always think, is there something I missed on a previous visit? But it just hit me how many times I've been there. Where is there an answer here in Mason City? What are we missing? At one point, I stopped by the billboard, our new billboard on Monroe, and I got teared up. There was just something so emotional for me, seeing Jodi's smiling face up there saying, "Don't sit in silence, the time to talk is now," on our billboard, and thinking, I hope somebody driving by this billboard is going to have an emotional connection as well. Somebody who might know something, who might kind of think they know something, will come forward. It was very emotional for me to be back there in Mason City.
And speaking of the billboard, and to your point, are there answers still in Mason City? I've always sort of assumed that whatever happened to Jodi, she is still within some kind of proximity of Mason City, and I think there are answers in that town that haven't been told or haven't been told to the right people, which is one of the reasons why we have the billboard up there to begin with. But in a lot of ways, that town is still the center of this case.
Exactly. And I think having that billboard in Jodi's face means Jodi is always in Mason City herself. She's there. You can't escape the billboard if you're going through town. Can see it a couple times a day or more. So Jodi is still in Mason City. She's not just a case somewhere in a police department file or something we're working on. It puts her presence and visibility in Mason City. And as far as we're concerned, we're going to keep that presence until Jodi is found.
One of the reasons I wanted to do this episode is because even in this age of Google Earth and citizen sleuthing and investigating cases online, as you know, there is no replacement for actually seeing a place and the dimensions and the geography and meeting the people. Not everybody is obviously able to do that, and so hopefully through this episode we can describe the area, the town, and specifically here, I want to focus on the Key Apartments, a place that you've been several times, many times. You covered the story from day one for WCCO, and now obviously as a member of the team. But it had been a while since you'd been to the Key Apartments before you and I went back there a couple of weeks ago. What struck you as sort of a refreshed memory of the Key Apartments overall?
Several things struck me. I think the immediate thing was just how small the complex is. When you get away from it and we talk about it, you hear apartment complex, 3 buildings. I think it's easier to think of it as a bigger site. The other thing that hit me in so many ways, it doesn't look any different. Yes, at night, there's lighting that wasn't there back the dark morning when Jodi disappeared, but overall, it looks so similar to back in the day. Standing there with you as we circled around and looked at it from different angles, it struck me that there are a lot of different places you could position yourself, at least initially, to watch Jodi's apartment. It was very easy to see. In terms of actually moving in and abducting her, you had to have a plan to be there really close to her car. But overall, it was a pretty easy place to do some staking out and keep a good eye on Jodi's apartment the entrance to her building, places like that.
For anyone who hasn't been to Mason City, how would you describe the apartment complex and the side of town it's on? Would you call this a populous area? Is it busy? Is it rural? Is it remote? How would you describe that to someone who's never been there?
Well, it's a good question. I just was asked that recently on another podcast. I wouldn't say it's remote, but across the street, there's a parking lot where there's a church, and maybe down the block, I believe there's some houses, but it's not heavily populated. There aren't a bunch of residential homes right there across from Jodi's complex. Quickly, it becomes a city. It becomes more populated, but not in that immediate spot where Jodi, in the front of the building on Kentucky, to where Jodi was living at the time.
And Jodi only had a 5-minute drive, if that, when she went to work in basically downtown Mason City. And her apartment complex is to the north and east of downtown and KIMT. Going back through the old footage, newspaper and video, it was presumed that whoever took Jodi, they had two choices to go out of the parking lot onto Kentucky Avenue. They could have gone north, which would be a left turn, or they could have gone south, which is the route Jodi took to work every day, which is a right turn. And it was presumed that they turned north because that's the fastest way out of town. If you turn north, you're about 4 minutes, a couple of turns away from being in the middle of a cornfield in Iowa and just a vast expanse of farmland. But in truth, while that's, I think, a reasonable assumption, we don't know which direction that they turned.
No, we have no idea. Everything's based on assumptions, what would seem logical. But one of the mistakes you can make in a case like this is to kind of project yourself what would be the logical way. We don't know what the perpetrator, what state of mind he would have had that morning. Would he have just impulsively gone one way or the other? We just don't know. And how planned was it? Is that a part of the plan? Or if it was something more spontaneous or less planned, it's 50-50 maybe. Who knows? Standing there up on the street there in Kentucky, as we watched it and looked at different angles going behind the building, clearly the person could watch it from a safe spot. But again, as I said, you'd have to have a plan to get down close to the exit from Jodi building, where we know there's just 12 steps to her car. So whatever you were doing to surveil it in advance, you would have to be in position down there. And most likely, it seems, looking back at the scene, the person would have had to have been concealed by the dumpster, which is just virtually next door to the entrance to the building, where Jodi would have been coming out of to go right to her car, less than 12 steps away. Yeah, I definitely want to get back to the dumpster and her entry and egress point. But you and I also walked to the south, the back of the building. Across the Winnebago River is a park. It's a fairly large public park back there. And so we were able to walk around and see the building C from the other side of the river, just to get kind of a topographical, geographical context. But that standing there, surreal to realize. I mean, that's the first place they look for Jodi, is right there in the Winnebago River. So the park on the other side had a Civil War reenactment go on the previous weekend. Obviously, a lot of people were there. The only thing that struck me, I guess, about the park, and then add your own impressions, that is one place you cannot see Jodi's apartment from, is across the river. Exactly. It would have been a place to stay and maybe camp out or hang out, but you could not see, granted we have 26 years plus of growth and trees, etc., but there's no way you could see Jodi's apartment from down there. You would have to, if you saw Jodi's apartment, you'd have to be up on Kentucky or off to the side of her apartment by the lot. You could not see it from behind there at the campground. And that's to the south, the park across the river. And the campground that you mentioned is to the west. And we talked a lot about the campground in the last episode of the podcast. It's interesting to weigh, because depending on the time of the year, you can see Building C and the entire, full view of Jodi's unit and all the other parking lot facing units from the campground. But when we were down there, it's late summer, early fall, there's a lot of foliage. Some of that's probably more grown than it was 27 years ago. So it's really hard for me personally to weigh the campground as sort of a stalking point potentially, because I don't know how well you can see through the foliage from the campground to Jodi's Building C from there. What were your impressions of the campground and the layout? The similar impressions, and a place somebody could have been staying, could have visited before. But in terms of stalking Jodi, keeping tabs on Jodi, that would not be a place to do that. Doesn't work. And I guess I was surprised. I hadn't looked at the campground in so many years, and just really both the proximity, but also the lack of visibility to Jodi's car, Jodi's apartment. Not a place that you'd be able to watch Jodi. Yeah, especially during the summer with all the trees in full foliage. All right, the building itself, the complex itself,
We've talked about the geography, hopefully adequately in previous episodes where people can get a picture, but I've always imagined sort of a bowl, parking lot, oval-shaped. Jodi's building C is to the south or on the left as you drive in. Then there are buildings A and B on the right as you drive in. One of my impressions being there with you that I'm not sure that I was aware of previously necessarily, but I became aware that in order for someone to feel comfortable in any kind of like prolonged stalking, they would have to be really comfortable with the fact that they're not going to be spotted or someone's not going to approach them and talk to them.
Exactly.
Apartment living is a bit insular on the one hand, but people are also aware of that kind of thing. I think even back then where if you see somebody walking around for 30 minutes, an hour, or whatever that might be, that they might raise an alarm to somebody. So whether they're in a vehicle or just kind of lingering in the area, this person had to feel very comfortable observing Jodi, which I think we feel that she was observed for some period of time at some point before the abduction. They had to have a reason to be there, or maybe just had a different sense of belonging or whatever it was. But stalking in that area, even though Jodi's apartment is very visible, you have to be extremely comfortable to do that in that setting.
Comfortable or bold. I think the only way you could probably do it would be staying in a vehicle, to eyeball it from a vehicle. The way we were up there, we were walking around the periphery and didn't seem to attract much attention ourselves to the amount of, we were there for maybe an hour. One thing that struck me as we were there too was a maintenance person we had watched for some time down there at one point came up to us and asked us if we were actually the building managers or owners. They were looking for a tool, but made me wonder, all the focus we've heard on somebody who knew Jodi, a serial rapist, could there have been somebody so off the radar like this person we saw when we were there, who might have been able to keep an eye on Jodi or had some connection with something like that.
And that goes into the comfort, or at least having a reason to be there for at least a little period of time on a regular basis every day. Delivery person, somebody who is doing some maintenance, something along those lines. To be able to stalk somebody there, you would stand out, I think, after a certain period of time, unless maybe you had a reason to be there.
Well, on the other hand, we were there this time during the day. If you were stalking Jodi at nighttime, I think in the comfort of darkness, there could have been easier ways to conceal yourself. Again, sitting in a vehicle, right, across the street, but in the middle of the day, I'm surprised we didn't attract more. Just people didn't seem to pay much attention as we were just walking around.
You were refreshed on where Jodi's car was parked, and we saw the entrance and the exit. It's been talked about so much over the years, 12 steps to her car and all that. That's how police presume that somebody was there waiting for her, which I guess on the one hand is a helpful piece of information. I think it's a safe assumption. But having now seen it again, it is amazing to see how short a distance that is from her door of the building to her car. And then eerie for me is, at one point we were standing at such an angle where, a scenario could almost play out in front of us, where if a person was waiting, let's say by the dumpster, Jodi may not observe that person right away. She's hurrying to get to work. She's late. And that person could approach at that angle from behind. And you can almost see how the attack might have played out right in front of us.
Oh, exactly. That's part of what hit me standing there. Just, again, Jodi was distracted. She's coming down the stairs, goes out the door to her car. Whoever had their eye on Jodi had to get presumably out of the vehicle they had been in or wherever their spot was to watch her, and then get in position by the dumpster to be ready to attack her. And I'm just wondering, as we looked again at the apartment, did the light go out? That was the signal. The light went out in Jodi's apartment, that she was going to be coming down the stairs. That person put himself in position to jump out at her by the dumpster. That's the only scenario, looking at it physically, that really stood out for me.
I think that makes sense. I think that's a safe assumption. And from the sidewalk there, I think it reinforces, too, that even if somebody were walking down the street, I think it's a bit of a jump for someone to even run over from the sidewalk or anywhere else and attack her, because it was such a short distance. I think that person probably would have had to have gotten into position for what they were planning on doing, or at least confronting her.
Yeah, I can't imagine a scenario of somebody walking by and getting across the parking lot, as you said. There just would not have been enough time, and I think in the rush, it probably would have attracted Jodi's attention. Yeah. Somebody's, sprinting across the lot.
We talked about this a little bit earlier, but there are several points in the parking lot and across the street, even up the street a little bit, where Jodi's unit is visible. Even, I realized, a little bit from the other parking lot to the north, and maybe some spots along the wooded area, the campground there. But the point is, Jodi can be seen from more places than she could see, even if she were looking out her window. Someone could even be concealed in a vehicle or some other obstruction and watching maybe for those signals of her lights going on and then going off again and then pulling into position.
Oh, exactly. I think it would have been very easy to do that, and just being there reinforced, for me, the most likely scenario of how the person would have progressed to contact her.
I don't know if you've thought about this since, but having seen the scene again and realizing what would have gone into the crime as it happened, at least as far as we know, what does that tell you about the person maybe generally? Do you have any impressions about what does the scene tell us? You talk a lot about investigators you've talked to over the years, listening to the scene and learning from it what it's trying to tell you. What about the scene and how this would have gone down? What's that tell you about the person that would have taken Jodi?
We talked a lot and thought about that a lot when we were there in the parking lot, and it seems to me it would have been a very chaotic, quick scene that Jodi is approached from behind, the person grabs her things go flying out of her bag, her blow dryer, keys, bent key, items found on the ground. We're in this chaotic moment. Then this person had to drag Jodi, get Jodi to the vehicle and get out of there. So it was both very precise to be able to attack the way that person did and also chaotic. And it happened so fast. And looking in the parking lot, you think, how could somebody not be looking out the window, or the risk of somebody looking out the window that the perpetrator was living with? But on the other hand, it was 4:20 in the morning, and I don't expect that many people would be looking out the window, but very, very quick. And I'd say chaotic, just the way things were strewn around her car in the parking lot.
I think that's a good observation. Even if it's planned, there is that struggle, that moment of chaos, which leads to, what do you make of the fact that nobody heard or saw anything? At least nobody called police, and a couple of people have reported hearing screams. But where do you put that in such a small area, in such a small scene at that hour?
As we've talked about somewhat before, perhaps the apartment life. Most of the people there did not have children. They were people working, going about on their lives on their own without a lot of commingling. But you would think a scream would grab someone's attention. But again, the lifestyle, the fact that there was a campground behind the complex where noises came from time to time. Sometimes if you hear something in the middle of the night, you're not sure what you've heard. I remember once we woke up, I was awakened to the sound of an earthquake, didn't know what it was. And it turned out when I went and checked, it was an earthquake. So you don't always know in the middle of the night what you're hearing. And down the road, when the police were interviewing people, I think people said, oh, yes, I did hear something. But it certainly was not enough for anybody to reach out to the police or at that point.
And you would hope if somebody actually looked out their window and saw the physical struggle happening that they would have called somebody. So I want to presume nobody actually saw the abduction.
I can't imagine if anybody saw what we saw, the aftermath of Jodi being abducted, the chaos by her car, the things strewn about. I can't imagine somebody would not have called police if they had seen what happened.
Watching people who live there come and go now, kind of just in their daily lives, I had the thought, too, about other women who lived at the complex at the time that Jodi did, and you wonder if the attacker came from them. They were known to maybe other residents of the complex, boyfriends, friends of boyfriends, friends of friends, whatever. Or is this a stalker who might have also or previously been interested in some of the same behavior with somebody else who lived there? Or do you think it was Jodi specific?
I think until we know what happened, we're just left to speculate. Certainly, Jodi was a very highly visible target. She was, as we talked about earlier, she was easy to track down. Her apartment number, phone number are listed in the phone book, so she would have been a very easy target. Her bright red new Mazda Miata right there, you could see where she would be going to. But I think you can't, until we know what happened, you can't rule out that there could have been somebody visiting who maybe had looked at some other young women at the building. Maybe they didn't know it was Jodi Huisentruit. We just don't know. It's just so striking at how easy it would have been to grab Jodi.
And it reinforces how difficult that would be for investigators in any situation when you have something like that in an apartment complex when police are so far behind in getting to the scene. Because where do you start? You've got the person, the tenants of the building, and around them are an entire 6 degrees of separation of possible people who have visited or are related or past relations. That's a tall mountain to kind of wade through if you're trying to see if there's a connection to the abduction, to the complex, or someone that lives there, even indirectly.
Well, in so many of these cases we followed over the years, we've seen that at the end it turned out to be somebody who had that connection. Could have been a boyfriend, a brief boyfriend, a passing boyfriend, somebody who knew somebody. We just don't know. I think the only thing that makes sense is it was not likely to be someone who was walking down Kentucky Avenue at 4:20 in the morning and stumbled across Jodi coming out of her building. That would not physically, I believe, work. So it had to either be somebody who was already in the building, who was familiar with it, or somebody who stalked her, who got to know Jodi. Jodi didn't have to know that person for someone to easily stalk Jodi and get to know her habits.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it would be easier to stalk her if she didn't know who they were. She wouldn't be less likely to recognize somebody like that.
Exactly. And who knows? Could it be somebody she'd met before and just approached her briefly and, she turned away? But it seems that appears that she was ambushed from behind, attacked from behind, from everything we've heard about on the car, the mirror being pushed forward, the chaos of things being spread nearby, then dragged through the silt to a vehicle and gone.
That's a good point. I think you and I can speak to this a little bit, being in public and sort of public figures. You sometimes meet people and talk to people and they remember the conversation that you have forgotten. And so I'm sad to say, embarrassed to say, there are times when I re-encounter people who remember me much more than I remember them. But that certainly would have been true for Jodi and her personality as well.
Oh, her personality, she popped on the screen, her visibility. I mean, it said she couldn't go to a grocery store and get out in less than 20 minutes or a half hour because people would want to talk to her. So she quickly became such a visible, likable fixture in that community. It's hard not to think that that could have been a factor if it wasn't somebody she already knew that was a factor in what happened to her.
So from your most recent trip to Mason City and the scene itself, any final thoughts or impressions that you took back home with you?
I think a resolve to not give up. There's something about actually being in the city where Jodi lived and worked for the last year and a half, to be there where her last moments are that we're aware of, to see her billboard, her face smiling down at us. So I would say the resolve is there, and also the sense that there's still potentially answers there. We saw it, I mentioned so many times before, the Jacob Wetterling case, where in the end, Jacob didn't go very far. A lot of the no-body type cases I've read about say that typically the people go to a comfort level. They don't go too far, all that far necessarily from where the crime happened. So I wonder if there's somebody in Mason City who has information who could break open the case. We just need that one person to come forward to the police department. If they're not comfortable going to the police, the state DCI, the FBI, reach out to us, reach out anonymously. Just hope that you don't keep that secret hidden in Mason City for another anniversary, another year of not knowing what happened to Jodi.
FindJodi is a nonprofit run by volunteers with a mission of keeping Jodi's unsolved case in the spotlight. Anyone with information about Jodi's case can reach out to the Mason City Police Department. Information can also be provided to the Iowa Department of Criminal Investigations. You can also contact FindJodi anonymously if you prefer. Don't sit in silence. The time to talk is now. For the entire FindJodi team, I'm Scott Fuller. Thank you for listening.